In the tumultuous days of medieval Europe, where justice was dictated with steel and fire, a shadowy figure stood as the enforcer of the law's will, the executioner. In an era marked by brutality and the public spectacle of punishment, these men embodied a troubling paradox. They were simultaneously feared and necessary, socially rejected but indispensable for maintaining order. One of the most infamous was Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg for nearly 40 years, whose service record logged more than 361 executions, as well as countless tortures and physical punishments. Hidden behind a hood that protected his identity and kept revenge at bay, Schmidt and others like him faced the task of carrying out cruel punishments that today challenge our understanding of humanity. What kind of man could bear the burden of a life dedicated to dismembering, decapitating, and burning other human beings? Were executioners monsters without remorse, or mere cogs in a ruthless system? The Forgers of Death, the art of creating executioners in the Middle Ages. During the Middle Ages, the executioner was a figure as feared as he was indispensable. In a society where justice was administered publicly to reinforce control and social order, these enforcers of sentences were essential. However, their profession was deeply stigmatized. They lived marginalized, feared for their skills and rejected for the symbolic weight of their role. Becoming an executioner was not a personal choice. It was a fate imposed by familial or economic circumstances. This journey, which began in adolescence, was both a technical apprenticeship and a psychological transformation that marked those who embarked on it for life. In most cases, the profession of executioner was inherited. Families dedicated to the dark art of execution kept the knowledge within a closed circle, ensuring that experience and skills were passed down to new generations. These families, like the famous Sanson dynasty in France, which operated for more than 2 centuries, trained their children from an early age. For the young apprentices, there was no alternative. Blood was their legacy, and the head executioner, usually the father, became their mentor. The training of an executioner began with the most basic tasks. Apprentices were tasked with preparing and maintaining the tools of the trade, from sharpening swords and axes to cleaning the remains of previous executions. As they grew, they were assigned more complex roles, such as assisting in minor executions. This gradual progression was essential, not only to perfect the technique, but also to desensitize the apprentice to the act of taking a life. The practice was constant and meticulous. A single mistake in handling the tools could result in public humiliation and discredit for the executioner. The technical training was not limited to the use of tools. Executioners were also instructed in various methods of execution that required precision and anatomical knowledge. Hanging, for example, had to be calculated carefully to avoid causing the condemned a prolonged death. Decapitation, performed with a sword or axe, required strength and skill to ensure the blow was clean. The more extreme methods, such as the breaking wheel, were particularly difficult, as the executioner was expected to inflict pain before death without unnecessarily prolonging the spectacle. A historical example that illustrates this process is Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the 16th century. Schmidt began his apprenticeship at 18 under the tutelage of his stepfather, who was also an executioner. Over decades, he perfected his craft and kept a diary where he recorded more than 361 executions. This document not only reveals the technique behind his work, but also the emotional and social implications of his role. For Schmidt, precision was both a professional imperative and a way to minimize suffering, which contrasts with the perception of executioners as insensitive figures. The psychological burden of the profession was immense. Executioners not only carried out brutal punishments, but also faced the contempt of a society that depended on them. They lived apart, often on the outskirts of towns, and their interactions with others were limited. Many turned to religion to justify their actions, seeing themselves as instruments of divine justice. This religious framework offered them comfort, but also reinforced their isolation, as their proximity to death made them almost taboo figures. Despite the stigma, an executioner could not afford to fail. The execution was a public act that had to be precise and swift. Any error, such as a poorly delivered blow or a mispositioned rope, could turn the spectacle into a disaster. The case of the execution of King Charles I of England in 1649 is an example of this. The executioner, visibly nervous, missed on his first attempt, requiring a second blow to complete the task. Such mistakes not only harmed the executioner's reputation, but also the perception of the authority he represented. The creation of an executioner was a process that went beyond technical training. It involved a mental transformation that allowed them to face the act of taking lives with professionalism and, in many cases, with a strange sense of duty. These individuals were not mere enforcers. They were the visible face of a system that used fear as a tool of control. Their hands carried out sentences, but their lives were marked by rejection, loneliness, and the burden of being the last face the condemned saw. Instruments of retribution, medieval execution tools. In the dark framework of medieval justice, the tools used by executioners were both functional and symbolic. Each instrument, from the rope to the breaking wheel, was designed to inflict exemplary punishment and ensure that the execution fulfilled its purpose of public intimidation. These artifacts not only reflected the executioner's technical knowledge, but also the inherent cruelty of the justice methods of the time. Among the most common tools was the hemp rope, essential for hangings. This method, primarily reserved for commoners, required a high and sturdy structure, such as a scaffold or gallows, from which the condemned would fall. The quality of the rope and its placement were critical, as an error could prolong the condemned's agony instead of causing a quick death through neck breaking. The executioner's sword, used for decapitations, was an iconic tool of precision. Sharpened to perfection, its purpose was to ensure a clean and decisive cut. However, in some cases, the axe was employed, considered less precise and more brutal. Both required meticulous preparation and rigorous training by the executioner, as a failed blow not only dishonored the executioner, but also turned the act into a spectacle of horror. The burning at the stake, used against heretics and witches, required a solid stake and an abundance of flammable materials such as wood and straw. The executioner had to ensure that the flames spread evenly, consuming the condemned in a fire that symbolized divine purification according to the beliefs of the time. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was one of the most macabre instruments. The condemned were tied with their limbs extended to the spokes of a massive wooden wheel. The executioner, with an iron bar or a mallet, methodically broke the condemned's bones, ensuring that the punishment was prolonged. Once the process was complete, the wheel was raised to expose the mutilated body, serving as a visual warning to the community. Other methods, such as boiling the condemned alive, though less frequent, underscored the macabre creativity of medieval justice. In these cases, large cauldrons were heated gradually, immersing the prisoner until death. This method, used to punish poisoners, demonstrated the severity of sentences reserved for specific crimes. Each instrument of retribution carried with it a clear message. Justice was absolute and merciless. The executioners, trained in the handling of these tools, were not only enforcers of sentences, but also craftsmen of a profession that defined the relationship between power, fear, and control in the Middle Ages. The shadow of punishment, the hidden identity of medieval executioners. At the heart of the medieval justice rituals, executioners stood as figures imbued with power and fear, cloaked in a carefully guarded anonymity. Their veiled identity was not only a measure of self-protection, but also a necessity born from social stigma and the inherent risk of their role. Through their distinctive attire and masks, these figures oscillated between the functional and the symbolic, representing both the power of the law and the burden of their social rejection. The stigma against executioners was not confined to their role as the enforcers of sentences, but extended to their families and relationships. They were considered social outcasts, untouchables who could rarely integrate fully into the community. This isolation led executioners to keep their identity secret, not only to protect themselves from possible retaliation by family members or friends of the executed, but also to preserve some semblance of normality in their daily lives. The most emblematic part of their anonymity was the hood or mask. Made from black cloth or leather, this garment completely covered the executioner's face, leaving only their eyes visible. In some cases, the masks were designed with grotesque features to intimidate the condemned, reinforcing the aura of terror surrounding their figure. This design not only concealed the executioner, but also transformed the act of execution into a more dramatic spectacle. The rest of their clothing was equally functional and symbolic. Executioners wore dark, unadorned clothes that allowed them to blend into the shadows and remain discreet. Long cloaks, leather gloves, and sturdy boots not only protected them from blood and other remains during the execution, but also added an aura of mystery. This attire served to depersonalize the executioner, turning them into an anonymous instrument of justice rather than a human being with a face and emotions. However, not all executioners remained in the shadows. Some, like Charles-Henri Sanson in France, gained notoriety and became recognized figures of their time. Sanson, despite his central role in the French Revolution, managed to project an image of integrity that earned him the respect of some of his contemporaries. His decision not to conceal his identity, even while overseeing such momentous executions as that of King Louis XVI, contrasts with the common practice of his colleagues and reveals the complexities of his role. Another interesting case is that of Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the 16th century. Although he adhered to the requirements of clothing and anonymity during his career, his retirement was a public statement against the stigma of his profession. Schmidt symbolically burned his executioner's axe, a gesture that marked his break from the role that had defined him and his desire to shed the weight of social rejection. The veiled identity of medieval executioners was not just a matter of functional anonymity, but a representation of their constant struggle with stigma and isolation. Their clothing was a reminder of the fine line they walked between being seen as necessary agents of justice and being treated as their own social prisoners. In each hood and cloak, there was not just a face hidden, but a fate shaped by need, fear, and solitude. The fate of the pariahs, the solitary life of medieval executioners. The medieval executioner, tasked with carrying out the most brutal orders of justice, lived trapped in a world of rejection and isolation. Despite their essential role in maintaining order, these individuals were considered untouchable, bearers of misfortune and bad luck. Their position marked them as outcasts, a fate that was often inherited from generation to generation, or imposed as punishment on the unfortunate who had no other option to survive. In most cases, the executioner and their family lived on the fringes of society, both literally and figuratively. They resided on the outskirts of cities, near cemeteries or desolate grounds associated with death. Even entering a city or town could be a humiliating experience. Some municipalities required them to announce their arrival, allowing residents to avoid them. This level of ostracism extended to almost all aspects of their lives, limiting social interactions and opportunities to establish normal relationships with their neighbors. The stigma did not end socially. Marriages for executioners were rare and, when they occurred, were often between families within the same profession, perpetuating the isolation. These bonds reinforced exclusion, creating an insular community that lived under the weight of collective rejection. Even the children of executioners, born into this cycle, faced a predetermined destiny of marginalization and shame. However, being rejected by society did not mean that executioners were completely devoid of support. The authorities that employed their services provided them with a modest salary, accommodation, and some legal protection, acknowledging the importance of their role in carrying out the law. But this official backing did little to alleviate the constant social pressure they faced. An executioner's income did not only come from their salary. At times they were allowed to claim confiscated goods from the condemned or accept bribes, as occurred with the infamous English executioner Jack Ketch. Although Ketch accumulated a small fortune, his brutality and incompetence made him a symbol of the public's contempt for his profession. Despite these adversities, some executioners managed to transcend their stigma and find purpose within their profession. Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg for 45 years, stood out for his meticulousness and sense of duty. Schmidt kept a detailed diary in which he documented his executions and his view of the profession as a necessary service to society. In his writings, one perceives a man who sought recognition for his skill and commitment, challenging the dehumanized image of executioners that prevailed in his time. The balance between the rejection and the dependence that society had on executioners reflected the paradox of their existence. These men were indispensable for maintaining order, yet lived as prisoners of a stigma that defined and relegated them to the margins. In their solitary and marked lives, there lies a complexity that goes beyond fear and brutality, revealing human beings trapped in a fate they did not choose, but whom they fulfilled with a mix of resignation, duty, and, in some cases, dignity. Blood money, the dark rewards of the medieval executioner. The medieval executioner, a figure shrouded in fear and societal rejection, not only carried the weight of his grim labor, but also the complexity of his financial compensation. Although his profession was despised, the authorities recognized the importance of his role in maintaining order, awarding him monetary rewards that varied depending on the region, the method of execution, and the profile of the condemned. One of the most common forms of compensation was a fixed salary, provided by the local or municipal authorities that employed the executioner. This income, though modest, offered some stability in a context where most jobs depended on variable conditions. In addition to this salary, specific fees were paid for each task performed. The complexity of the punishment determined the additional remuneration. A simple hanging earned a basic fee, while more elaborate methods, such as dismemberment or burning at the stake, warranted a higher premium due to the skill and effort required. In some regions, executioners also received bonuses for high-profile executions, such as those of influential figures or condemned individuals whose sentences involved extremely elaborate methods. These public executions, often attracting large crowds, represented an opportunity to earn more income, but also exposed the executioner to more intense public scrutiny. Besides the salary and fees, executioners could enjoy certain benefits. One of the most significant was legal protection, which exempted them from responsibility for actions committed in the exercise of their duties. This benefit was crucial, as it mitigated the risk of legal or physical reprisals from the families and friends of the executed. In some cases, executioners were provided free housing, typically on the outskirts of towns. While this housing reinforced their social isolation, it also provided them with a safe place to carry out their duties. On other occasions, executioners had exclusive access to markets or resources intended solely for their guild, a concession that helped mitigate the economic stigma associated with their work. One of the more macabre forms of compensation was the right to claim the belongings of the condemned. This benefit could be particularly lucrative when the victim was wealthy or of high rank, as their personal belongings often included jewelry, expensive clothing, or even property. While this practice was regulated in some places, in others, it was a significant source of income for the executioner. Similarly, some executioners could receive a portion of the fines imposed on the condemned or their families, adding another economic dimension to their profession. These inheritances not only provided them with additional income, but also reinforced the symbolic power of their position as agents of justice. Despite these forms of compensation, the finances of the executioners were often unstable, leading some to seek additional income through less honorable means. It was common for them to accept bribes in exchange for a quicker or less painful death, especially in prolonged execution methods such as dismemberment or burning at the stake. They were also involved in the illicit trade of human remains, selling body parts from the executed to doctors, alchemists, or private collectors. This clandestine trade highlights the paradox of the medieval executioner. Although despised by society, he was also dependent on it, forced to navigate between economic necessity and the moral burden of his profession. In a world where survival often required sacrifices, even the darkest agents of justice had to find ways to sustain themselves. Executioners' rituals between divine justice and the grim preparation of death. The medieval executioner, more than just an executor, was a central figure in a ritual filled with symbolism and solemnity. His profession was not limited to inflicting death. Every action was governed by carefully structured practices that combined technical preparation, spiritual rituals, and post-execution obligations. These ceremonies, imbued with meaning, sought to provide a sense of order to an inherently chaotic and brutal act. Before each execution, The executioner would dedicate time to inspect and prepare his tools. The sword or axe, symbols of his profession, were meticulously sharpened to ensure a clean and precise cut. Similarly, the hanging rope was checked to avoid any failures that could prolong the suffering of the condemned. In the case of more complex devices, such as the breaking wheel or the structures used for dismemberment, the executioner would ensure they were calibrated with precision. These steps were not only mechanical, they reflected the professionalism of the executioner and his desire to minimize error. A botched execution not only dishonored the executor, but could also undermine the authority of the justice he represented. In an act where precision was key, every detail mattered. The act of taking a life was no light task, not even for an experienced executioner. Before each execution, many turned to spiritual rituals to find comfort and strength. Personal prayers, meditations, and invocations to patron saints were common. These practices sought not only to invoke divine protection, but also to justify the act as a necessary service within the framework of divine justice. The spiritual dimension of the profession helped executioners cope with the moral dilemmas of their work. This element transcended the practical, giving them a sense of higher purpose that helped them deal with the emotional burden their labor entailed. In some cases, executioners even acted as spiritual guides for the condemned, ensuring they received the last rites or encouraging them to confess their sins before facing death. The moment of execution itself was filled with symbolism and ceremonialism. In many local traditions, the condemned was allowed to enjoy a final meal or make a last confession before a priest. In other cases, the condemned was publicly humiliated, turning the punishment into a spectacle designed to deter the population from committing future crimes. The executioner, as the central figure in this ritual, embodied the arm of justice. His presence not only represented the authority of the state or the church, but also the collective retribution of a society that saw in these executions a way to affirm its moral order. The execution was not simply an act of punishment. It was a public ceremony designed to reinforce social norms and remind everyone of the consequences of deviating from them. After carrying out the sentence, the executioner's work was far from over. He was responsible for the disposal of the condemned's remains, a task that varied according to local traditions. In some cases, the bodies were buried in unconsecrated ground, reflecting their exclusion even in death. In others, the bodies were burned or publicly displayed as a warning, ensuring that the punishment continued even after life had ended. Moreover, the executioner often participated in the distribution of human remains for educational or macabre uses. Doctors and alchemists could acquire body parts for studying anatomy or using in their practices, while private collectors valued them as curiosities. This trade reflected a disturbing aspect of the executioner's role. He was not only the bearer of death, but also the administrator of what remained afterward. The Emperors of Darkness, executioners who left their mark on history. Throughout history, certain executioners stood out for their impact on the events of their time. Beyond the anonymity that characterized many, these individuals left clear records of their role in the most decisive moments, whether due to their precision, brutality, or notoriety. Their influence transcended the scaffold, leaving a permanent mark on the annals of justice and power. Franz Schmidt, the meticulous record of the German executioner. Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg, operated during the 16th and early 17th centuries. Born in 1555 in Hof, Germany, Schmidt inherited his profession from his stepfather, as was common in executioner families. Over 45 years, he carried out more than 350 executions, documenting each one in a diary that remains one of the most detailed sources about the life and executions of his time. Schmidt not only performed executions, but was also involved in other corporal punishments, such as amputations and tortures. His diary reveals that he viewed his work as a public service aimed at ensuring social order. Despite the social rejection tied to his profession, Schmidt earned respect in some circles due to his professionalism and meticulous approach. His legacy endures as a unique testimony to the life of an executioner in medieval Europe. Jack Ketch, the clumsiness that became legend. Jack Ketch, active in England during the 17th century, became synonymous with botched executions. His reputation was cemented after a series of incidents. the most infamous being the beheading of the Duke of Monmouth in 1685. According to records of the time, Ketch required at least 5 blows to complete the task, causing horror among the spectators. This event left an indelible mark on his career, and his name became a warning of what happened when professionalism failed. Despite his notoriety, Ketch also symbolizes the importance of precision in a profession where errors could humiliate the executioner and the justice they represented. His story serves as a reminder of how an unprepared executioner could become the center of a public scandal. Tom Horn, Law and Punishment in the Wild West. In the 19th century American West, Tom Horn occupied a unique place in the history of executioners. Originally an explorer and sheriff, Horn also served as an executioner during a time when the frontier was a place of swift and brutal justice. His most controversial role was the hanging of Willie Nickel, a young man accused of cattle rustling. Although Horn fulfilled his duty, his involvement in this case made him a polarizing figure. Ultimately, Tom Horn faced his own execution in 1903, accused of murder. His story reflects the ambiguous nature of justice in the West, where the lines between the executioner and the condemned were often blurred. Anatole Débler, The Silent Efficiency of the Guillotine. Anatole Débler, the official executioner in France in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, is remembered for his precision and professionalism. He oversaw more than 400 executions with the guillotine, including high-profile cases such as that of anarchist Ravachol and serial killer Henri Landru. Unlike other notorious executioners, Débler avoided public attention and led a quiet private life. His professional approach made him a symbol of the transition from public executions to a more methodical and less sensationalist process in modern France. The most notorious executioners in history didn't just carry out sentences, they shaped the perception of justice and punishment in their respective eras. Their names, recorded in official documents and memoirs, reflect the complexities of their roles and how society needed them, even as it often despised them. Each of them represents a different facet of a profession as vital as it is dark, leaving a legacy that still fascinates and disturbs today. The theater of punishment. The impact of public executions in the Middle Ages. Public executions in the Middle Ages were more than an act of justice. They were a collective event that combined entertainment, deterrence, and demonstrations of power. These ceremonies, held in squares and strategic locations, attracted crowds who sought not only to witness retribution, but also to participate in a ritual that reinforced the social and political structures of the time. In a world without modern media, public executions were one of the main forms of entertainment. Prior announcements ensured large crowds gathered early to witness the event. Street vendors sold food and drinks, creating an atmosphere that mixed festivity with macabre. Executions became community events where the condemned's suffering served as collective catharsis. The audience, composed of people from all social strata, immersed themselves in the spectacle. Taunts, shouts, and even laughter accompanied the process, as spectators projected their fears and frustrations onto the condemned. This public theatre allowed the population to indirectly confront their anxieties about social order, turning the prisoner into a symbol of everything that threatened stability. Beyond entertainment, public executions served a practical purpose: to deter crime. In a time when law enforcement was limited, these extreme demonstrations sought to instill fear. The methods of execution were designed to be as visible and terrifying as possible. The breaking wheel, burning at the stake, or beheading not only punished the criminal, but also sent a clear message to the observers. Breaking the law had definitive consequences. The psychological effect was powerful. The images of mutilated bodies or those hung from the gallows were seared into the collective memory, reminding everyone of the boundaries that should not be crossed. This practice consolidated social control by using punishment as a tool for discipline. Public executions were also a political platform. Authorities, from local leaders to monarchs, used them to showcase their dominance over life and death. These events were carefully organized to highlight the power of the state or the church, with high-ranking figures present to reinforce the message of authority. The use of executions as political theatre was particularly evident in cases of treason or high-profile crimes. The brutality of the punishment accompanied by solemn rituals and the presence of figures of power, underscored the supremacy of the ruling classes and the cost of challenging their control. Public executions in the Middle Ages left a lasting impact. They represented an effective means of maintaining order in a time of uncertainty, but also reflected the relationship between power, punishment, and the population. Each event was a visual narrative that reminded both the fragility of life and the strength of established power. Although these spectacles faded over time, their memory persists as an unsettling reminder of how justice and spectacle converged on a stage of social control. From darkness to light, the transformation of the executioner throughout history. The executioner, a central figure in the darkest chapters of justice, has traveled a complex path from medieval times to the modern world. This journey not only reflects the transformation of their role, but also profound changes in conceptions of justice, morality, and humanity. From the anonymity of hoods to the clinical environments of today, the evolution of the executioner mirrors the evolution of society itself. In the Middle Ages, the executioner was the embodiment of retribution. Working under the command of civil and religious authorities, these figures played a crucial role in maintaining social order through exemplary punishments. Equipped with axes, swords, or ropes, they were responsible for administering sentences ranging from beheadings to burning at the stake, acts that served both punitive and public spectacle purposes. However, this power came with a significant stigma. Executioners and their families were relegated to the margins of society, regarded as untouchables. Anonymity, often ensured by hoods or masks, not only protected their identities but also reinforced their isolation. This role was inherited or imposed, rooted more in necessity than personal choice. With the advent of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, ideas about justice began to shift. Capital punishment remained common, but voices advocating for more humane and equitable methods began to gain ground. It was in this context that the guillotine emerged, a device designed to democratize execution. Invented by Dr. Joseph-Ignace Guillotin and adopted during the French Revolution, the guillotine aimed to ensure a swift and painless end, regardless of the condemned's social status. The introduction of this technology transformed the role of the executioner. The manual skills that once defined the profession were replaced by mechanical operation. While this reduced the suffering of the condemned, it also further dehumanized the act, separating the executioner from the execution process. This change marked the beginning of the transition to a more systematized and less visible approach to punishment. During the 19th century, the debate over the morality of capital punishment intensified. In Europe and America, philosophers, writers, and abolitionist movements questioned not only the justice of the death penalty, but also the role of the executioner. These discussions led to reforms in many countries, limiting public executions and reserving capital punishment for extreme cases. In the United States, the abolitionist movement gained strength, challenging the legitimacy of state-sanctioned execution. This shift in attitude not only affected society at large, but also further marginalized executioners, whose roles began to disappear in regions that abolished the death penalty or adopted more discreet methods. In the 20th century, the traditional executioner, with their hood and manual tools, gave way to specialized technicians. Methods such as lethal injection, the electric chair, or the gas chamber transformed the act of execution into a clinical procedure. Executions, now confined to sealed rooms, became less visible, reflecting a change in public perception of punishment. In countries where the death penalty persists, the modern executioner operates in an environment of anonymity and professionalism. They are no longer a public figure but a cog in a legal machinery designed to minimize the emotional and symbolic impact of the act. This evolution has relegated the executioner to the margins of history, but their role remains a reminder of the tension between justice, morality, and power. The transformation of the executioner, from the dark corners of the Middle Ages to the mechanized procedures of modernity, reflects progress in our understanding of justice and humanity. However, it also serves as a cautionary tale. The role of the executioner, though relegated and nearly forgotten in many parts of the world, remains a testament to the complexities of human morality and the relationship between law and violence. By remembering these stories, we ensure that the lessons of the past are not lost, lighting the way toward a future where justice is truly equitable and free from the shadows of retribution.